In the early morning darkness of August 1st, 1917, 6 masked men climbed the stairs of a boarding house on North Wyoming Street. What they did that night would never be solved, never be prosecuted, never be fully explained. The man they came for was already broken, his ankle fractured, his body failing. Yet they still came. And when the sun rose over the Montana mining town, a message hung from the railroad trestle, written in violence and silence. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the hanging at the trestle. Now let's begin. Tonight, I want to tell you about something that happened over a century ago in a place called Butte, Montana. It's a story about copper and courage, about men who worked in darkness, and about how power moves through a town when nobody's watching too closely. This isn't a story with easy answers. There are no neat conclusions, no satisfying courtroom scenes where justice prevails. What we have instead is something quieter and more unsettling. A glimpse into how far people will go to protect what they believe is theirs, and how quickly a life can be erased when it becomes inconvenient. I'm going to take my time with this. We'll walk through it together, slowly, the way you'd walk through an old mining town at dusk, when the shadows are long and the history feels close. Let's begin where most stories about Butte begin, deep underground where the copper was. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. Butte, Montana sat on top of what people called the richest hill on earth. Underneath the streets, underneath the houses and saloons and churches, there were miles and miles of tunnels. They went down half a mile in some places, a labyrinth of shafts and drifts and raises carved out of rock. The men who worked down there, thousands of them, were digging out copper. By 1917, copper had become essential. Not just valuable, but essential. The electrical age needed it. The war in Europe needed it. Every wire, every shell casing, every piece of military equipment required copper, and Butte was producing more of it than anywhere else in the world. The mines ran 24 hours a day. The money flowed up to company headquarters in New York and Boston, and the men kept going down into the earth. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company controlled most of it. By this time, Anaconda was one of the largest corporations in America, one of the most powerful companies in the world. They owned the mines. They owned the smelter in the town of Anaconda, 26 miles away. They owned the railroad that connected them. They owned much of the press. In Montana, what Anaconda wanted generally became what Montana got. But Butte had never been a company town in the traditional sense. It had too much history, too much pride. The miners had organized early, back in the 1880s. For decades, the Butte Miners Union had been one of the strongest labor organizations in the West. It was local number 1 of the Western Federation of Miners. Men came from all over the world to work in Butte, and they brought their politics with them: Irish revolutionaries, Finnish socialists, Italian anarchists. The city had even elected a socialist mayor. Then something changed. In 1914, the Miners' Union fell apart. It happened during a bitter internal fight, accusations flying, violence in the streets. Someone dynamited the Union Hall on North Main Street. 2 men died in the explosion. The Union, weakened and divided, never recovered. The mines went open shop. For the first time in 30 years, the men had no real protection, no unified voice. And the danger kept growing. Mining had always been dangerous, but by 1917, the pace of work had accelerated. The war demanded more copper, faster. Safety measures that might have slowed production were often ignored. Men died regularly, crushed by falling rock, poisoned by bad air, burned by underground fires. Their families received little compensation. If a man wasn't married, if his parents weren't citizens or weren't in the country, the company owed them nothing except $75 for funeral expenses. The miners noticed. They talked about it in the boarding houses, in the saloons, in quiet conversations before their shifts. They had seen friends die. They had breathed the bad air. They knew the timbers in some tunnels were rotting, that the safety systems were inadequate. But without a union, what could they do? Then came June 8th, 1917. Just before midnight, a fire started in the Granite Mountain mine. It began with something almost absurdly mundane. Workers had been installing an electrical cable, ironically part of a sprinkler system meant to improve safety. The cable was massive, 3 tons of copper and lead wrapped in oil-soaked paraffin paper. At some point, it slipped from its clamps and fell into a tangled coil deep in the shaft. When a foreman went down to inspect the damage, his carbide lamp touched the oily insulation. The fire spread instantly. The flame climbed the cable, reached the wooden timbers lining the shaft. Within minutes, the shaft had become a chimney, drawing in oxygen, pushing out thick, toxic smoke. The smoke filled the tunnels of not just Granite Mountain but the interconnected speculator mine next to it. 410 men were working the night shift when the fire started. Some made it out immediately, scrambling up ladders, running through connecting tunnels to adjacent mines. Others weren't so lucky. The smoke was heavy with carbon monoxide. Men trying to find their way in the darkness simply fell where they stood, overcome. Some groups sealed themselves behind makeshift walls. Bulkheads, they called them, using timber and mud to try to keep the poison gas out. For days, rescue teams searched the mines. The heat was blistering. The smoke was so thick with tar that it left a residue on everything it touched. Some men were found still alive, trapped behind their bulkheads, waiting in the dark for rescue that almost didn't come. Others were found where they had fallen, their last moments spent writing notes to their families. One note, written by a miner named Duggan to his wife and mother, said, "I've not confided my fears to anyone, but welcome death with open arms. To my wife and mother, it takes my heart to be taken from you so suddenly and unexpectedly. But think not of me, for if death comes, we'll be in a sleep without suffering." When the rescue operation ended 8 days later, 168 men were dead. It remains the deadliest hard rock mining disaster in American history. Every family in Butte knew someone who died. The funerals went on for weeks. The city stopped. Everything stopped. And in that silence, anger began to build. Within days, miners started walking off the job. Not just at the Granite Mountain and Speculator, but at mines all over Butte. It wasn't organized at first. It was spontaneous, organic. Men simply refused to go back down into conditions they knew were unsafe. The strike spread. Thousands of miners stopped working. They had no union to lead them, no established organization. So they formed a new one, hastily, desperately. They called it the Metal Mine Workers Union. The timing couldn't have been more complicated. 3 months earlier, the United States had entered World War I. President Wilson had asked for a declaration of war in April. Now, in June, with American troops preparing to ship overseas, copper production was more important than ever. The government needed Butte's copper for the war effort. And here were the miners shutting down production. The mine owners and the federal government saw the strike as potentially disloyal, maybe even treasonous. The miners saw it as necessary, as the only way to force changes that would keep them alive. Both sides dug in. The summer heat pressed down on Butte. Tensions rose. And into this situation came a man with a broken body and an unbreakable will. His name was Frank Little. Frank Little had been born in Illinois around 1879, though some records said 1878. His early life was marked by hardship. His father was a doctor who moved the family to Oklahoma during the land rush of 1889, hoping for a new start. The family became homesteaders, but drought and the economic panic of 1893 left them in poverty. Little ended up in the mines. It was hard work, dangerous work, but it gave him an education in how power operated in industrial America. He joined the Western Federation of Miners, then later the Industrial Workers of the World when it formed in 1905. The IWW, known as the Wobblies, was different from other unions. It wasn't interested in negotiating better terms within the existing system. It wanted to abolish the system entirely. The IWW's preamble declared that the working class and the employing class have nothing in common. Little became an organizer, traveling throughout the West wherever workers were in conflict with their employers. He organized miners, lumberjacks, oil field workers. He was arrested repeatedly, often on charges that were clearly pretextual. In Spokane, he was sentenced to 30 days in jail for reading the Declaration of Independence in public. He was small, 5 feet 11 inches, but only 135 pounds by some accounts. But his commitment was absolute. By 1916, he had been elected to the IWW's General Executive Board. He was, by any measure, one of the most prominent labor organizers in America. He was also, by the summer of 1917, barely able to walk. Earlier that year, he had been beaten in El Paso, Texas, kicked so severely that he developed a double hernia. Then, in June, he broke his ankle. He could no longer hop freight trains the way organizers typically did. He had to buy train tickets. He moved slowly, painfully, on crutches. Despite his condition, he went to Arizona in July. The Bisbee deportation had just occurred, one of the ugliest episodes in American labor history. On July 12th, sheriffs and deputized vigilantes in Bisbee had rounded up nearly 1,200 striking copper miners and their supporters. They forced them onto cattle cars and boxcars without food or water in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Then they shipped them across the state line to New Mexico and left them in the desert. Little visited the deportees. He spoke with them. He documented what had happened. And then he decided to go to Butte. The strike in Butte needed experienced leadership. The Metal Mine Workers Union was new, disorganized. The IWW sent Little to help. He arrived in late July, moving slowly on his crutches, his body clearly failing. But his voice still worked. He spoke at rallies. Thousands of miners gathered to hear him. He talked about solidarity, about the need for workers to stand together against companies that valued profit over human life. He was blunt about the war, more blunt than many in the IWW leadership wanted. He said that workers should refuse the draft, refuse to fight in a war that served corporate interests while workers died underground. It was dangerous talk. The country was gripped by war fever and paranoia. Anyone who spoke against the war risked being labeled disloyal, un-American, possibly a German agent. The federal government had passed the Espionage Act just weeks earlier, making it illegal to interfere with military recruitment. People were being arrested for anti-war statements. Newspapers were being shut down. But Little didn't soften his message. At a rally at Columbia Gardens, he spoke to 6,000 miners. He told them that the same companies that let men die in unsafe mines were now wrapping themselves in patriotism, demanding production for the war effort. The speech was reported in newspapers across the country. It was called seditious. It was called treasonous. The mine owners wanted him gone. Local newspapers demanded action. There were rumors, never confirmed, never fully investigated, that company officials held meetings to discuss what to do about Frank Little. The Hennessy Building downtown housed the offices of several mining companies. Later, some would claim the order came from there, from the 6th floor. Little knew he was in danger. Friends and fellow organizers urged him to leave Butte, to go somewhere safer. He refused. He wrote to a friend, saying he had faced threats before and wouldn't be intimidated. He kept speaking. He kept organizing. He was staying in a boarding house on North Wyoming Street, not far from uptown Butte. The neighborhood was working class, full of miners and their families. The landlady knew he was an organizer. Other boarders knew too. It wasn't a secret. The last day of July was a Tuesday. Little spent it as he had spent most days since arriving, meeting with miners, planning strategy, probably writing correspondence. His body hurt. Walking was agony, but he kept working. That evening, he returned to the boarding house. He went to his room. He went to bed. It was the last time anyone would see him alive and free. The knock came at 2:30 in the morning, or maybe it was closer to 3. In the accounts that survive, the exact time varies slightly. What doesn't vary is the description of what happened next. 6 men were at the door. They wore masks. Some reports say they wore handkerchiefs over their faces. Others mention hoods. All agree they were armed. They forced their way into the boarding house. The landlady heard the commotion. She came out of her room to see what was happening. The men told her to stay back. Some accounts say they identified themselves as officers, though they showed no badges, no warrants. They went upstairs to Little's room. Little was asleep. He woke to find the men standing over him. He tried to fight them. Later, an autopsy would find skin under his fingernails, evidence that he had struggled, that he had clawed at his attackers. But he was outnumbered, injured, taken by surprise. They gagged him with a towel or cloth. They grabbed him out of bed. He was wearing only his underwear, no shoes, no crutches. They dragged him down the stairs. The landlady watched, horrified. She couldn't identify the men through their masks. She couldn't stop them. She heard Little struggling, heard the sounds of violence. Then they were out the door, shoving him into a waiting automobile. A large car, dark-colored. Possibly a Cadillac, some would later say. The car drove through the empty streets of Butte. It's not clear what route they took. This was early morning, the hour when miners were heading to work, when shift changes filled the streets near the mines. But wherever the car went, nobody stopped it. Nobody intervened. At some point, and this detail is one of the most disturbing in a story full of disturbing details, the car stopped. The men dragged Little out. They tied him to the rear bumper. Then they drove on, dragging him through the streets. Imagine the sound of it. The scrape of flesh on pavement. The weight of a human body being pulled along rough ground. How far they dragged him is unknown. Some reports say several blocks. What's certain is that by the time they reached their destination, Little's kneecaps had been scraped off. The bones were exposed. Their destination was on the edge of town, just past the city limits. A railroad trestle carried the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line over a dirt road. The trestle was wooden, old, isolated. A perfect place for what they had planned. They carried Little up onto the trestle. They had rope with them already fashioned into a noose. A proper hangman's noose with coils designed to break the neck. They put it around his neck. They threw him off the trestle. But something went wrong. Whether the rope was the wrong length, or whether Little's weight was less than they anticipated, the fall didn't kill him immediately. The drop wasn't far enough to break his neck cleanly. Instead, he hung there, strangling slowly. It would have taken minutes. His body would have convulsed, fighting for air. His hands, tied behind his back, would have strained against the bonds. Eventually, he died. His body hung there in the darkness, swaying slightly in the night breeze. Before they left, the men pinned something to Little's body. A note. It read, "First and last warning." Below that were some initials, LDCSSWT, which were understood to be the initials of other Union leaders in Butte. The L for Little was circled, and below the initials was a set of numbers that sent a chill through anyone in Montana who saw them. 3777. 3777 was Vigilante Code. It had been used by the vigilance committees in Virginia City, Montana back in the 1860s, during the gold rush days when vigilantes hanged suspected criminals and road agents. Some said the numbers represented the dimensions of a grave 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, 77 inches deep. Others had different interpretations. What mattered was that everyone knew what it meant. It meant that this was vigilante justice. It meant that law had been suspended in favor of something older and more brutal. The men drove away. The trestle stood empty and quiet. Little's body hung there as the night slowly gave way to dawn. A railroad worker found him around 6 o'clock in the morning. He had been walking along the line, doing his rounds, and he looked up and saw the body. He ran to get help. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered. People stared up at the body, at the note pinned to it. Photographs were taken. The images would appear in newspapers across the country. The coroner came. They cut Little down. His body was taken to the Duggan Mortuary on North Main Street, directly across from where the old Miners' Union Hall had stood before it was dynamited. An autopsy was performed. It confirmed what was obvious. Cause of death was hanging. But it also noted the other injuries, the kneecaps scraped to bone, the bruises, the skin under his fingernails. The news reached the IWW almost immediately. Telegrams went out to chapters across the country. The response was immediate and intense. IWW members began flooding into Butte. Hundreds of them came, then thousands. They came to pay their respects. They came to show solidarity. They came because one of their leaders had been murdered. The reaction in Butte itself was more complicated. Many miners were outraged. They had heard Little speak. They respected his courage. The lynching felt like an attack on all of them, on anyone who dared to question the mine owners. But others, especially among the business community and those who supported the war effort, were less sympathetic. Some newspapers suggested that Little had brought it on himself with his inflammatory speeches. The Butte Miner, which was essentially a company newspaper, published editorials that came close to justifying the lynching. Federal authorities arrived to investigate. The murder had occurred just outside city limits, which meant it fell under county jurisdiction. But given the circumstances, a murder in the context of a labor dispute during wartime, federal officials wanted to be involved. Burton K. Wheeler, a federal attorney, was assigned to the case. Wheeler was an unusual figure. He was progressive by the standards of his time, sympathetic to labor. He would later become a U.S. Senator, one of the most powerful politicians in Montana. But in 1917, he was a young attorney trying to navigate impossible pressures. The federal government wanted him to prosecute IWW members for sedition. The mine owners wanted the strike broken. And Wheeler found himself looking at a murder case that nobody seemed eager to solve. He interviewed witnesses. He examined evidence. He issued statements saying that he would not prosecute people simply for expressing unpopular political opinions, that the First Amendment still meant something. It was a brave stance. It also made him enemies. The investigation went nowhere. The landlady couldn't identify the masked men. Other witnesses, if they existed, didn't come forward. The note with the numbers and initials was examined but yielded no leads. The car, the rope, the men themselves, all of it disappeared into silence. There were theories, of course. There were always theories. Some said the killers were company guards, men on Anaconda's payroll whose job was to deal with troublemakers. Some said they were vigilantes, local citizens who had taken matters into their own hands. Some said they were both, a coordinated action by company officials and sympathetic locals. One name that came up repeatedly was Peter Prolja. He was a motorcycle officer with the Butte Police Department. Before that, he had worked as a security guard for Anaconda. In 1926, an IWW member named William Dunn publicly identified Prolja as one of the killers. Dunn said he had evidence, witness testimony. Nothing came of it. Prolja was never charged. Another name was Ira Morrissey. At some point, the exact timing is unclear, Morrissey was said to have scratches on his face. Little had fought his attackers. He had skin under his fingernails. The implication was obvious. But again, nothing happened. No charges. No prosecution. The truth is that by the time these names started circulating, it was too late. The investigation had stalled. The war had created an atmosphere where questioning authority was dangerous. And the IWW, the organization that might have pushed hardest for justice, was about to be destroyed. Within weeks of Little's death, federal agents raided IWW offices across the country. Hundreds of members were arrested. Their records, correspondence, membership lists, everything was seized. Many were charged under the Espionage Act. Some were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. The organization never recovered. The strike in Butte continued through the summer. But without effective leadership, with federal troops now stationed in the city to maintain order, the miners slowly drifted back to work. By December, the strike was officially over. The Metal Mine Workers Union dissolved. The men went back into the mines, back to the same dangerous conditions. Frank Little's body remained in Butte. There was talk of sending it elsewhere, to Chicago or another city where the IWW was strong. But Bill Haywood, one of the IWW's founders, said Little should be buried in Butte. He said the grave would serve as a reminder, as a symbol. He said it would be safe from mobs in Butte because the miners would protect it. The funeral was held on August 5th, 4 days after the murder. It became the largest funeral in Butte's history. 10,000 people lined the streets as the procession passed. 3,000 more walked in the procession itself. The coffin was carried by union members. Behind them walked miners, workers, families. It was a silent march, dignified, powerful. Little was buried in Mountain View Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking Butte. A simple grave marker was placed. Years later, someone added an inscription: slain by capitalist interests for organizing and inspiring his fellow men. The case was never solved. No one was ever charged. No one was ever prosecuted. Frank Little's murder remains, more than a century later, officially unsolved. In the weeks and months after Frank Little's death, something strange happened in Butte. People stopped talking about it. Not completely, there were still whispers, still theories discussed in private. But publicly, the murder faded from conversation. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The federal investigation quietly ended. It was as if the whole city had agreed, tacitly, to let it go. Part of this was fear. The lynching had sent its message clearly. Speak too loudly for workers' rights, oppose the war effort, and you might be next. The note with the initials of other union leaders was still fresh in memory. Those men were still in Butte, still organizing, still vulnerable. Silence seemed safer. But part of it was also something more complex, more difficult to name. Butte was a city built on contradictions. It was a union town where the union had been broken. It was a place where workers and bosses lived on the same streets, drank in the same saloons, attended the same churches. Many of the vigilantes who might have participated in the lynching, if vigilantes were indeed responsible, would have been working men themselves, men with grievances of their own but who saw the IWW as too radical, the wartime strike as too dangerous. The historian Michael Punk, in his book about the speculator mine disaster, wrote about how crisis reveals character. The events of 1917 revealed Butte's character in all its complexity. The city could produce both tremendous solidarity, 10,000 people marching in a funeral procession, and terrible violence. It could be a place where workers stood together for justice and a place where murder could go unpunished. The federal troops stayed in Butte until 1921. Their presence was a reminder that the federal government, whatever its stated principles, would always side with production over protest during wartime. The mines kept running. The copper kept flowing to the war effort. By the time the war ended in November 1918, Butte had supplied an enormous portion of the copper used by the Allied forces. But the cost had been high. Beyond the 168 men who died in the speculator fire, beyond Frank Little's murder, there were the miners who went back to work in conditions they knew were unsafe. There were the families who lost breadwinners and received minimal compensation. There were the IWW members who were arrested, imprisoned, blacklisted, or simply driven into hiding. In 1920, another violent incident occurred. Company guards opened fire on striking miners in what became known as the Anaconda Road Massacre. 17 men were shot, most of them in the back as they tried to flee. One died. Again, no one was prosecuted. The pattern was clear. Violence against workers, even murder, carried little risk for those in power. Some of the IWW members who came to Butte for Little's funeral never left. They stayed, hoping to keep organizing, hoping to keep his spirit alive. They used the phrase "we never forget" as a rallying cry. But without a strong organizational structure, without legal protections, their efforts yielded little. The IWW's influence in Montana gradually disappeared. The story of Frank Little did fade from public consciousness, at least for a while. But it never completely disappeared. Labor historians kept it alive. Local activists in Butte remembered. And occasionally, new evidence would surface, or someone would come forward with a claim about what really happened. In 1971, a retired Anaconda mine worker was interviewed as part of an oral history project. He talked about the atmosphere in Butte in 1917, the fear and paranoia. He confirmed what many suspected. that the lynching had been planned, that certain people in positions of power had known it would happen. But he wouldn't name names. Even 54 years later, he was still afraid. The physical evidence from the murder was gradually lost. Little's personal effects, his writings, even the death mask that was made from his face, all disappeared over the years. The funeral had been filmed, a rare thing for 1917. That film, which would be an invaluable historical document, was also lost. Even Little's relatives were afraid to talk about him. His siblings, his extended family, they knew that association with a martyred radical could bring trouble. Some changed their names. Some moved away from areas where their connection to Little was known. The family, like so many families touched by political violence, carried the weight of it silently. The mining companies, meanwhile, went on to even greater success. Anaconda became one of the largest corporations in the world by the 1920s. It diversified beyond copper, buying lumber companies, newspapers, political influence. It became, as historians have noted, not just a company in Montana, but effectively the ruler of Montana. Governors were elected with Anaconda's support. Legislation was written to Anaconda's specifications. The company's influence permeated every level of state government. This power lasted for decades. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s, as mining became less profitable and environmental concerns grew, that Anaconda's grip on Montana finally loosened. In 1977, the Atlantic Richfield Company bought Anaconda. By 1983, most mining operations in Butte had shut down. The mines that had driven everything, that had shaped the city's entire existence, finally fell silent. What was left behind was both a physical and a social landscape marked by extraction. The Berkeley Pit, a massive open-pit mine that had been dug where underground mines once operated, slowly filled with contaminated water. The tunnels beneath the city, miles and miles of them, sat empty and flooded. The environmental damage was so severe that Butte became one of the largest Superfund sites in the country. But people stayed. Butte remained a city, smaller than it had been but stubbornly alive. And slowly, the history that had been suppressed, the stories that had been too dangerous to tell, began to resurface. In 2002, a filmmaker named Travis Wilkerson made a documentary called An Injury to One. It told the story of Frank Little and the speculator disaster and the broader history of labor conflict in Butte. The title came from an old IWW slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all." The film was stark, experimental, but it put the story back into public consciousness. A few years later, a group of podcasters who were Montana natives created a series called Death in the West. They investigated Little's murder, interviewed historians, examined what little evidence remained. They placed the lynching in the broader context of labor violence in the early 20th century. The podcast found an audience, people who were interested in this hidden history. Books were written. Academic papers were published. Slowly, the silence broke. What emerged from all this research and remembering was a more complete picture, though still not a complete one. The murder of Frank Little was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of violence against labor organizers that stretched across the American West during this period. The Bisbee deportation, the Jerome deportation, shootings at strikes in Colorado and West Virginia, these were all part of the same story. It was a story about what happens when corporate power becomes so great that it can effectively suspend the rule of law. It was a story about how wartime patriotism can be weaponized against dissent. It was a story about the price paid by those who try to organize collective action against entrenched interests. And it was a story without clear heroes or villains, at least not in the simple sense. Yes, the mine owners who prioritized profit over safety were culpable for the deaths of workers. Yes, the men who lynched Frank Little were murderers. But the miners who went back to work, who chose survival over solidarity, could they be blamed? The local citizens who supported the lynching because they genuinely believed the IWW was dangerous, were they simply wrong? Or were they also victims of propaganda and fear? History doesn't offer easy answers to these questions. What it offers instead is the slow accumulation of facts, the patient work of trying to understand how things happened and why. One fact that became clearer over time was the extent to which the federal government cooperated with corporate interests in suppressing labor organizing. The raids on IWW offices, the prosecutions under the Espionage Act, the deployment of federal troops to break strikes, these weren't aberrations. They were policy. At the highest levels of government, decisions were made that prioritized industrial production and corporate stability over workers' rights and civil liberties. President Wilson, who had positioned himself as a progressive, presided over one of the most severe periods of government repression of labor in American history. The Espionage Act, which he supported, was used primarily not against actual spies but against socialists, anarchists, and labor organizers. The Palmer raids of 1919 and 20, which came just after the war ended, resulted in thousands of arrests and hundreds of deportations of foreign-born radicals. The IWW never recovered from this assault. By the early 1920s, it was a shell of its former self. Some locals continued to exist, but the dream of building one big union that could challenge capitalism itself was effectively dead. Today, if you visit Butte, Montana, you can still see the grave. Mountain View Cemetery sits on a hillside north of town, with views of the mountains and the old mine headframes that still the landscape. Frank Little's grave is marked by a simple stone. The inscription, "Slain by capitalist interests for organizing and inspiring his fellow men," remains visible, though weathered now by more than a century of Montana weather. People still visit. Labor historians, activists, people interested in radical history. Sometimes they leave small tokens. Coins, flowers, notes. It's become a pilgrimage site of sorts, a place to remember not just one man but an entire era of struggle. The railroad trestle where he was hanged is gone. The line was eventually abandoned, the trestle dismantled. A road passes through the area now. There's no marker, nothing to indicate what happened there. You could drive by without knowing. The boarding house on North Wyoming Street is also gone, replaced by other buildings. The streets of Butte have changed. Some neighborhoods were demolished for mining operations. Others decayed as the population declined. The uptown area, where so much of the action took place in 1917, is now partly preserved as a historic district, but it's quieter than it once was, emptier. What hasn't disappeared is the memory, or at least a version of it. In Butte, people still talk about Frank Little. Not everyone, maybe not even most people, but enough to keep the story alive. There's pride in Butte's labor history, even if that history is complicated, even if it includes violence and failure alongside solidarity and courage. In 1996, the city finally erected a memorial to the victims of the Speculator Mine disaster. It stands near the old granite mountain shaft, visible for miles. The memorial includes plaques with the names of all 168 men who died. It honors not just them, but the 2,500 miners who died in Butte's mines over the course of more than a century. 16 flags fly there, representing the nationalities of the speculator victims: Irish, Finnish, Serbian, Italian, Austrian, and others. It's a reminder of how international Butte was, how the story of American labor is inseparable from the story of immigration. The memorial also includes audio recordings. Press a button and you can hear the last words of some of the miners, read aloud. These are the notes they wrote while trapped underground, knowing they might die. The messages are heartbreaking in their simplicity. To my wife and children, be good to each other. Tell mother I thought of her at the end. Papa's at the hospital. A man came and said Papa was not dead in the mine, but he's at the hospital. This last one was especially cruel. A message written by a boy who didn't yet understand that his father wasn't coming home. Standing at that memorial, looking out over the scarred landscape of the Butte Hill, it's impossible not to think about cost. The copper extracted from these mines lit cities, built weapons, powered an industrial revolution. But it was pulled from the earth by men who died young, whose lungs filled with rock dust, whose families received little compensation, whose attempts to improve their conditions were met with violence. Frank Little's murder fits into this larger story. He came to Butte at a moment when workers were trying to assert some control over their own fates, and he paid for it with his life. His killers were never caught because, Fundamentally, no one in a position of power wanted them caught. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. But here's what's also true. 10,000 people showed up for his funeral. Workers from across the country sent money to support his family. His name became a rallying cry for a generation of labor organizers. He scared powerful people enough that they felt the need to kill him. That suggests he had power too, just a different kind of power. The question that lingers, the question that probably always lingers with cases like this, is what would have happened if he had lived? Would the strike have succeeded? Would the IWW have grown stronger in Montana? Would conditions have improved sooner? Or would he have been arrested under the Espionage Act, imprisoned, his influence curtailed anyway? There's no way to know. History doesn't run experiments. We're left with what actually happened, and what actually happened is that a small, injured man stood up to some of the most powerful interests in America, and they killed him for it. The case remains unsolved. That's the official designation. No arrests, no trial, no conviction. The file, wherever it exists in some government archive, is presumably still marked open, though no one has actively investigated in decades. The men who planned it, the men who carried it out, the men who knew about it, all of them are long dead now. Whatever secrets they kept, they took with them. But the absence of legal resolution doesn't mean the case is truly unresolved. We know enough. We know that Frank Little was murdered by men who opposed his union organizing. We know that local and federal authorities made little effort to find his killers. We know that the murder served its purpose. It terrified other organizers, it weakened the strike, it sent a message about what would be tolerated and what wouldn't. What we're left with, more than a century later, is a story that still resonates because the forces it describes haven't disappeared. The tension between labor and capital, the use of violence to suppress dissent, the way governments align with corporate interests during times of crisis. These patterns remain visible. The details change, the tactics evolve, but the underlying dynamics are recognizable. This is why people still study what happened in Butte in 1917. This is why Frank Little's grave still receives visitors. This is why his story continues to be told. Not because it offers a simple moral lesson, but because it's part of a larger argument about justice, power, and who gets to define what's acceptable. The IWW, before it was crushed, used to sing songs. Labor songs, union songs, songs that told stories about workers and their struggles. One of the most famous was Solidarity Forever, written by Ralph Chaplin, who was the editor of the IWW newspaper. The song is still sung today at union meetings and protests. It includes these lines: "They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong." Frank Little would have known that song. He would have sung it. And on some level, he died believing its message, that collective action, solidarity among workers, was the path to a better world. The fact that he was murdered for believing this doesn't make it untrue. It just makes it costly. As you drift toward sleep, thinking about this story, consider what it means to stand up for something when the cost might be everything. Consider what it means that a society allows such violence to go unpunished. Consider what it means that we remember some victims and forget others, that some graves become monuments while others fade into unmarked ground. Frank Little has a marked grave. His name is remembered, but there are countless others. Miners who died in accidents that could have been prevented, workers who were blacklisted for organizing, families who were destroyed by poverty and disease, whose names we'll never know. They're part of the same story, even if they don't have individual narratives. The deepest darkness isn't in the murder itself, horrific as it was. The deepest darkness is in the silence that followed, the decades when speaking about what happened was dangerous, when even Little's own relatives were afraid to claim him. That kind of erasure, that kind of enforced forgetting, is how power maintains itself. But stories have a way of surviving. They go underground for a while, but they come back. Frank Little's story came back. The story of Butte's miners came back. And with their return comes an obligation to ask what we learned, whether things have changed, what we owe to those who paid such a high price. The sun rose over Montana on August 1st, 1917, and Frank Little was dead, hanging from a trestle, a warning to anyone else who might have his courage. The sun will rise tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. The world keeps turning, but somewhere, someone is reading his name on that gravestone. Somewhere, someone is learning what happened, and that small act of remembering, of refusing to let the silence be complete, matters more than it might seem. Rest now. Let the story settle. Let the questions it raises drift through your mind as you slip toward sleep. Tomorrow is another day. The struggles continue. The work of justice, slow and uncertain as it always is, continues. Frank Little never saw justice in his lifetime, but he saw something else. He saw people willing to stand together, willing to risk something for a principle. In the end, maybe that's what actually matters. Not whether you win or lose, not whether justice comes in your lifetime, but whether you stood for something when standing carried a cost. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Man Who Became a Mystery. In the summer of 1979, a family searching for arrowheads in an Idaho cave made a discovery that would remain unexplained for 40 years. What they found, wrapped in burlap and buried shallow in the earth, would lead investigators backward through time. Past decades of silence, through the chaos of Prohibition, to a single violent night in May of 1916. The body had no head. The man had no name. And somewhere in the darkness of that cave lay the answer to a question no one yet knew to ask. What happens when violence meets violence, when justice becomes revenge, and when a killer himself becomes the killed? Tonight, we're going to explore a story that spans more than a century, a mystery that connects the pioneering spirit of the American West with the cutting edge of modern forensic science. This is a story about choices and consequences, about the ripples one violent act can send across generations. It's also a story about patience, the slow, methodical work of scientists and genealogists who refused to let a man remain unknown, even when that man was himself accused of terrible things. You don't need to remember every detail as we go. Just let the story wash over you. Some parts will stay with you, others will blend into your dreams, and that's exactly as it should be. We'll move through this tale at a gentle pace, taking our time with each chapter, each revelation. There's no urgency here, only the quiet unfolding of events that happened long ago in the high desert country of Idaho, where the wind still moves through ancient caves and the past refuses to stay completely buried. So let yourself relax, let your breathing slow, and let's begin at the beginning, in the territory that would become Idaho, in the 1800s when Mormon pioneers were carving out new lives in an unforgiving landscape. The story of Joseph Henry Loveless begins, as many American stories do, with migration and faith. On December 3rd, 1870, in the small settlement of Payson in what was still Utah territory, a boy was born to parents who had traveled halfway across a continent in search of religious freedom. His father, Joseph Jackson Loveless, had come from Indiana. His mother, Sarah Jane Scriggins, from Massachusetts. They were part of the Great Mormon Migration, believers in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who had followed Brigham Young westward after the death of Joseph Smith. The Loveless family tree was complex in the way many pioneer Mormon families were. Joseph Henry's grandfather, John Jasper Loveless, had embraced the practice of plural marriage, taking 4 wives in accordance with church doctrine at the time. This meant Joseph Henry grew up surrounded by cousins, dozens and dozens of cousins, all bearing the Loveless name or connected to it through marriage. The practice of polygamy, combined with the tendency of small pioneer communities to intermarry, would create a genealogical puzzle that wouldn't matter for another century and a half, but would eventually become crucial to identifying his remains. We know very little about Joseph Henry's childhood. The historical record offers us only glimpses: census records, a birth certificate, the shadow of a boy growing up in the Mormon settlements of Utah Territory. What shaped him? What turned him toward a life of deception and violence? These questions have no clear answers. We can only observe that by the time Joseph Henry Lovelace reached adulthood, something fundamental had shifted in him, or perhaps had always been there, waiting. In 1899, at the age of 28, Joseph Henry married a woman named Harriet Jane Savage in Salt Lake City. Those who knew her called her Hattie. She was 20 years old. They had a daughter together, a little girl named Thelma Lavina. For a brief moment, it might have seemed that Joseph Henry Lovelace was settling into conventional life. A wife, a child, a future unfolding in predictable ways. But Joseph Henry Lovelace was not built for conventional life. By 1903, just 4 years into the marriage, Hattie had reached her limit. She filed for divorce on grounds that would become grimly familiar in Joseph's story: desertion and failure to provide for his family. The court documents tell us that Joseph Henry simply stopped coming home, stopped supporting his wife and daughter, vanished into whatever life he was leading elsewhere. The divorce was granted in May of 1904. Joseph Henry did not even appear in court. Hattie would later remarry, trying to build a stable life for herself and young Thelma. She died in 1924, never knowing what became of her first husband. By August of 1905, barely a year after his divorce, Joseph Henry had moved north into Idaho and married again. His second wife's name was Agnes Octavia Caldwell, and she would become the central tragedy of this story. Agnes had been born in Malad City, Idaho, in 1880. Like Joseph, she had grown up in a Mormon community. Like Joseph, she had been married before. Her first husband was a man named William Glenn. Whether Agnes knew the full truth about Joseph Henry's past when she married him is lost to history. What we do know is that between 1906 and 1914, she bore him 4 children. They lived in Bear Lake County at first, then moved to the area around Du Bois in what was then Fremont County, later to become Clark County. This was rugged country, high desert terrain where the winters could be brutal and the summers scorching. The land around Du Bois sits at over 5,000 feet in elevation, with mountain ranges visible in every direction. It was, and remains, a place where people could disappear if they wanted to, where the landscape itself seemed to encourage a certain kind of independence from the law. Because by this time, Joseph Henry Lovelace had fully embraced a criminal life. He had become a bootlegger, and he was good at it. Idaho, like many western states, had strong temperance movements. The state would officially go dry in January of 1916, 4 years before national prohibition. But Fremont County had exercised what was called the dry option law even earlier, making the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal within its borders. This created opportunity for men like Joseph Henry Lovelace, men willing to break the law, men who saw in prohibition not a moral imperative but a business opportunity. Joseph Henry didn't just bootleg. He also dealt in counterfeit bills, adding another layer of criminality to his activities. And he developed something of a specialty: escape. He was arrested multiple times throughout 1913 and 1914, and each time he managed to get out of jail. His method was consistent and simple. He hid a small saw blade in his boot, waiting for the right moment when guards were distracted or absent, then methodically cut through the bars of his cell and walked out into the night. The local newspapers began to take note. After one escape in 1914 from the jail in Burley, a newspaper editorial suggested, remarkably, that perhaps it was best that he'd gotten away, that maybe the county was now rid of him and that attempting to recapture him wasn't worth the trouble. There's something almost weary in that sentiment, a sense that Joseph Henry Lovelace had become more nuisance than threat, that maybe letting him disappear into the landscape was preferable to the endless cycle of arrest, incarceration, and escape. But Joseph Henry didn't disappear. He stayed in the area, living with Agnes and their children, continuing his bootlegging operation. and he developed a pattern of using aliases, Walter Cairns, with various spellings, Cairns, Curran, Currans, Kernans, Charles Smith, perhaps a dozen other names. It's unclear whether Agnes knew about all these identities, whether she understood the full extent of her husband's criminal activities. What is clear is that by 1916, their relationship had deteriorated. Neighbors would later testify that Joseph and Agnes fought frequently. These weren't minor disagreements. These were the kind of arguments that could be heard from outside their tent. Because by this time, they were living in a tent on the outskirts of Du Bois. Whether they'd been evicted from more permanent housing or whether Joseph preferred the mobility and anonymity of tent living is unknown. But it placed them on the margins, literally and figuratively, at the edge of town and the edge of society. The prohibition law that took effect in Idaho in January of 1916 changed the landscape for bootleggers. What had been a quasi-legal activity in some counties became uniformly illegal across the state. Law enforcement became more aggressive. The penalties became stiffer, and men who had operated in a gray area suddenly found themselves squarely in the crosshairs of the law. For Joseph Henry Lovelace, the pressure was mounting. For Agnes, living in a tent with 4 children and a husband who was constantly on the run from the law, life must have felt increasingly desperate. We'll never know exactly what happened between them in those final days. We'll never know if Agnes threatened to leave, to turn him in, to take the children and start over somewhere else. We'll never know if Joseph's violence toward her was new or if it had been building for years. What we do know is that in early May of 1916, something broke. The fragile structure of their life together, held up by lies and aliases and constant movement, finally collapsed. And when it collapsed, the violence was absolute. The night of May 5th, 1916, was like any other night in Du Bois, Idaho. The town was small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business or thought they did. In the tent where Joseph and Agnes Lovelace lived with their children, the darkness held a terrible secret that wouldn't be discovered until morning. Morning came to Du Bois on May 6, 1916, and with it came the discovery that would set everything else in motion. It was one of the children who found her. Accounts suggest it was their 8-year-old son, though some reports say 2 of the children were present. Imagine that moment. A child waking, perhaps calling out for his mother, receiving no answer, and then approaching her bed in the tent they called home. Imagine what he saw there. Agnes Octavia Caldwell Lovelace had been killed with an axe while she lay sleeping. The attack had been savage. Newspaper reports from the time, which were graphic in the way Victorian-era reporting often was, noted that her head had been nearly severed from her body. There was no question this was murder. There was no question it had been brutal. And there was no question that whoever killed her had stood over her while she slept, had raised the axe, and had brought it down with force and fury. The scene that greeted investigators was chaotic. A tent on the outskirts of town, a dead woman in her bed, children present who had either witnessed the killing or its immediate aftermath, and a husband who gave his name as Charles Smith who claimed, incredibly, that it wasn't him, that it must have been Agnes's former husband, William Glenn, who had killed her. The accusation was absurd on its face. William Glenn had remarried. He had a new family. He had no apparent motive to kill a woman he'd divorced years earlier. But Charles Smith, Joseph Henry Lovelace, insisted on this story. He was arrested on May 11th, 1916, under the name Walter Cairns, another of his many aliases. The authorities didn't immediately realize that Walter Cairns and Charles Smith were the same man, or that both names belonged to Joseph Henry Lovelace, a man with outstanding warrants for bootlegging and jail escapes. The funeral for Agnes was held on May 16, 1916. It must have been a grim affair. A woman in her 30s, dead by violence, leaving behind 4 children who ranged in age from about 3 to 10 years old. Members of her family came to Du Bois for the service. Her parents, siblings, people who had known her before she met Joseph Henry, people who perhaps had warned her about him or had tried to help her escape his influence. We don't know what was said at that funeral, but we know what one of her sons said. Standing there, perhaps not fully understanding what had happened or what was coming, the boy told someone, Papa never stayed in jail very long and he'll soon be out. The child was right. 2 days after the funeral, on May 18, 1916, at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, Joseph Henry Lovelace executed another of his trademark escapes. The guards at the St. Anthony Jail, which was where he was being held, had gone to supper. The timing was perfect, perhaps too perfect. Some investigators later speculated that Lovelace might have had help from outside, that someone might have been passing him tools or creating a distraction. But whether he worked alone or with assistance, the result was the same. He produced his hidden saw blade, cut through the bars of his cell, and walked out into the fading light of that May evening. A wanted poster was issued. It described Walter Cairns, one of his aliases, as a white male wearing specific clothing: blue ribbed overalls, a red maroon sweater, black trousers underneath. The poster noted his hair color, his build, his age. It warned that he was dangerous, that he was wanted for murder. The reward for information was modest by modern standards but significant for the time. And then Joseph Henry Lovelace, by whatever name he was using, vanished. The year 1916 was a strange time in Idaho. The state had just gone dry, but the national prohibition was still 4 years away. This created a patchwork of enforcement, with some counties taking the alcohol ban seriously and others essentially ignoring it. The country was watching the war in Europe, wondering if America would be drawn in. It would be just a year later. The Wild West was supposedly tamed, but in places like eastern Idaho, the old ways still held. Violence was often met with counter-violence. Justice was sometimes handled outside the court system, and a man like Joseph Henry Lovelace, who had thumbed his nose at the law repeatedly, who had escaped from jail multiple times, and who had now murdered his wife in front of their children. Such a man might find that he had made more enemies than friends. What happened next remains unclear in its details, but tragically clear in its outcome. Joseph Henry Lovelace disappeared from all official records after May 18, 1916. No one reported seeing him on the roads. No one spotted him boarding a train. No one found him working under a new alias in a new town. He simply ceased to exist in the documented world. But people don't just vanish, not really. Especially not in 1916 in rural Idaho, where strangers were noticed, where travelers were remembered, where a man in blue overalls and a maroon sweater would be recognized from the wanted posters if he tried to move through town. So if Joseph Henry Lovelace didn't leave the area, where did he go? And if he didn't leave, who found him? The most likely scenario, the one that investigators and researchers would come to favor decades later, is that justice found Joseph Henry Lovelace very quickly after his escape. Perhaps it was members of Agnes's family, who had come to Du Bois for her funeral and who had seen what he'd done to her. Perhaps it was local vigilantes, men who were tired of Lovelace's crimes and escapes and who decided that this time, he wouldn't be given the chance to run again. Perhaps it was even law enforcement operating unofficially, unwilling to go through the process of recapture and trial and inevitable escape. Whoever it was, they were thorough. They caught Joseph Henry Lovelace, probably within days of his escape, possibly within hours. They killed him, and then they dismembered his body with what forensic examination would later suggest were multiple different sharp tools. They removed his head entirely. They wrapped the pieces in burlap sacks, and they carried him to a place where they thought he would never be found. The Buffalo Cave, as it was called, was part of a system of limestone caves near Du Bois. These weren't show caves or tourist attractions. They were dark, dangerous places that required local knowledge to navigate safely. In years to come, during the Cold War, some of these caves would be designated as civil defense shelters, stocked with supplies in case of nuclear attack. But in 1916, they were simply holes in the earth, passages into darkness, places where the temperature stayed cool year-round and where the dry air could preserve things for a very long time. The torso was buried in a shallow grave, only about 18 inches deep, wrapped in burlap. The limbs were disposed of in other parts of the cave system, also wrapped in burlap. The head was never hidden with the rest of the body. It was either destroyed completely, thrown into a ravine, or carried off as some kind of proof or trophy. The saw blade that Lovelace had used for so many escapes, the tool that had become his signature, also disappeared. Whether it was taken by his killers or lost in the struggle is unknown. And then the killers, whoever they were, walked back out into the Idaho sun and went about their lives. No one was arrested. No one was questioned. The official record simply shows that on May 18th, Walter Cairns escaped from the St. Anthony jail and was never recaptured. Case open. Case cold. The whole thing wrapped up and filed away like something that didn't quite need solving, like maybe everyone involved, the law, the community, even Agnes's family, understood that this particular kind of rough justice was acceptable given the circumstances. Back in Payson, Utah, where Joseph Henry Loveless had been born, someone eventually placed a headstone in the Loveless family plot. It bore the name Joseph Henry and his birth year, 1870. The space where the death year should have been carved was left blank. It's unclear who erected this stone or when, but it stood as a kind of question mark, a placeholder for a life that had ended somewhere, sometime, in some way that no one seemed to know or want to discuss. Agnes's youngest children, Edison and Claude, went to live with their maternal grandparents in Soda Springs, Idaho. Edison even changed his surname to Caldwell, perhaps wanting to distance himself from the Loveless name and all it represented. The older daughter, Thelma, who was from Joseph's first marriage, went on to live her own life, marry, have children. None of them knew what had happened to their father. The question of where he'd gone and how he died would remain unanswered for their entire lives. Thelma died in 1972, Edison in 1965, Claude in 1964. They all went to their graves without knowing that their father's remains lay in a cave less than 2 hours' drive from where they'd grown up. The years passed. 1916 became 1917. America entered the Great War. The war ended. The 20s roared, then crashed. The Depression came. Another world war. The atomic age. The 60s. The 70s. And through all of it, in a cave near Du Bois, Idaho, something waited in the darkness. Something that would eventually be found. Summer days in Idaho can be beautiful. The high desert landscape takes on a golden quality, the mountains sharp against the endless blue sky. On August 26, 1979, a family decided to explore the Buffalo Cave near Du Bois. They were looking for arrowheads, artifacts from the various Native American tribes who had inhabited the region long before Mormon pioneers or bootleggers or anyone else had arrived. Cave systems were good places to find such things. Sheltered from the elements, sometimes revealing layers of human occupation going back thousands of years. Instead of arrowheads, they found something else. Wrapped in burlap and buried about 18 inches below the surface of the cave floor was the torso of a human body. It had no head. It had no limbs. But it was remarkably well preserved, mummified by the cool, dry conditions of the cave. Bits of clothing still clung to it. Dark pants, a white shirt with blue pinstripes, a red-maroon sweater. The family contacted the authorities. Retired Fremont County Sheriff Earl Holden responded to the scene. Deputies searched the area with metal detectors, hoping to find other remains or perhaps some indication of who this person had been. They found nothing else that day. The torso was carefully removed, photographed, documented. The county medical examiner estimated, based on the condition of the remains, that the body had been there for perhaps 10 years, maybe a bit less. This would place the death in the late 1960s or early 1970s. They were off by about 50 years. The torso was turned over to Idaho State University, where anthropology students and faculty began the painstaking work of trying to determine who this person had been. They could tell it was a male. They could determine he had been of European descent. His hair, still partially present, was reddish-brown. They estimated his age at death to be around 40 years old. Beyond that, they had very little to work with. Without a head, they couldn't do dental comparisons. Without records to compare to, they couldn't identify marks or injuries that might narrow down the possibilities. The man became known as Buffalo Cave John Doe, one more unidentified body in a case that seemed unlikely ever to be solved. The remains were examined by forensic specialists from the FBI. They were studied by experts from the Smithsonian Institution. Everyone agreed on the basic facts. White male, middle-aged, dead for some period of time that was hard to pin down precisely, killed and dismembered with various sharp tools. But no one could put a name to him. The case went cold, filed away with hundreds of other unidentified remains across the country. Then, on March 30th, 1991, a young girl exploring the same cave system made another discovery. She found a mummified hand. It was still attached to an arm. Investigators returned to the cave and conducted a more thorough search. They found the other arm. They found both legs. All of them had been wrapped in burlap, just like the torso. All of them were remarkably preserved, but there was still no head. Without the skull, dental records were useless. Without the head, facial reconstruction was impossible. The case remained frustratingly open, the identity tantalizingly close yet completely out of reach. More years passed. The remains were stored. Students studied them as part of their anthropological training. Papers were written about the preservation conditions in the caves, about the techniques that had been used to dismember the body, about the possible age of the remains. But the man stayed nameless. What changed everything was technology and tenacity. By the early 21st century, DNA testing had become sophisticated enough to extract genetic material from very old remains. Companies had begun offering ancestry DNA tests to the public, building massive databases of genetic information. And a group of volunteers had formed something called the DNA Doe Project, dedicated to using forensic genealogy to identify unknown remains. In 2017, Idaho State University anthropologists Samantha Blatt and Amy Michael, working with the Clark County Sheriff's Office, reached out to the DNA Doe Project for help. Could modern genetic genealogy solve a case that was decades old, from remains that might be a century old? Seemed like a long shot, but it was worth trying. The first challenge was extracting usable DNA. The remains were well preserved, but they were still old, potentially contaminated, exposed to cave conditions for decades. A bone sample from the right femur was taken and sent to the University of North Texas. Then, in 2019, a sample from the left tibia was sent to a lab called Othram, which specialized in extracting DNA from degraded remains. The tibia sample worked. They were able to build a genetic profile of the Buffalo Cave John Doe. But having a DNA profile was only the first step. The real work, the work that would take more than 2,000 volunteer hours over about 15 weeks, was the genealogical research. The DNA Doe Project team uploaded the genetic profile to various databases and began building a family tree. They were looking for living relatives, people whose DNA would match closely enough to suggest a family connection. What they found was complicated. The genetic markers suggested the man came from a family with significant polygamy in its recent past. This meant the family tree was enormous, with hundreds of potential cousins and relatives to track down. The researchers had to work backward through census records, marriage certificates, birth certificates, death certificates, old newspaper articles. They had to account for the practice of intermarriage within small religious communities. They had to consider the fact that people in the late 1800s and early 1900s often moved frequently and sometimes used multiple names. They narrowed their search to descendants of a man named John Jasper Lovelace and his wife Rachel Mahala Anderson. This couple had lived in the Utah Territory in the mid-1800s. John Jasper had been a polygamist with 4 wives. Their descendants were scattered across the western United States. The DNA Doe Project team needed to find someone closely related enough to confirm a match. One of John Jasper's sons was Joseph Jackson Lovelace, who had married Sarah Jane Scriggins. They'd had 4 sons: Jedediah Jackson, Joseph Henry, Raphael Grant, and John Franklin. Initially, it appeared that all 4 brothers had documented death dates. But as the researchers dug deeper, they found an error. The death record for Joseph Henry Lovelace was actually a copy of his brother Jedediah's death record. The dates were the same. It was a clerical mistake, possibly made decades earlier when records were being transferred or consolidated. When the researchers checked the Lovelace family plot in Payson, Utah, they found Joseph Henry's headstone with only a birth date, no death date filled in. This was the breakthrough they needed. They searched newspaper archives for any information about Joseph Henry Lovelace. What they found was startling. Articles about a woman named Agnes Caldwell who had been murdered in 1916 by a man named Charles Smith. Articles about Walt Cairns who had escaped from jail. Articles about Walter Currens who was wanted for bootlegging. As they pieced together the various aliases and compared them to physical descriptions and locations, they realized all these names belonged to the same man. Charles Smith was Walter Cairns, was Walter Currens, was Joseph Henry Lovelace. The newspaper articles provided crucial details. The wanted poster issued after Lovelace's final escape described him wearing a light-colored hat, brown coat, red-maroon sweater, and blue overalls over black trousers. The clothing found on the remains in the cave included the red-maroon sweater and black trousers. The match was too specific to be coincidental. The man had been wearing the same clothes he'd escaped in, which meant he died very shortly after May 18, 1916, probably within days, possibly within hours. But DNA evidence was still needed for absolute confirmation. The researchers located an 87-year-old man living in California who was Joseph Henry Lovelace's grandson through his daughter Thelma. The grandson agreed to provide a DNA sample. He had known his grandfather's name but had never known what happened to him, had never known about the murder or the escapes or any of it. The family had simply accepted that Joseph Henry had disappeared and left it at that. When the DNA comparison came back, it was a match. 3 generations separated by time and tragedy, connected by an unbroken genetic thread. On December 31, 2019, the Clark County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce the identification. Sheriff Bart May stood with representatives from Idaho State University and the DNA Doe Project. They revealed that Buffalo Cave John Doe was Joseph Henry Lovelace, a bootlegger and murderer who had died in 1916 at age 46. His remains had been in the cave for approximately 63 years before the torso was first discovered, far longer than anyone had initially believed. The identification made national news. It was the oldest cold case ever solved using forensic genealogy. The story had everything: the Wild West Prohibition-era crime, escaped convicts, unsolved murders, advanced DNA science, dedicated volunteers working thousands of hours. Media outlets picked up the story. The case became something of a sensation, at least as much of a sensation as a 100-year-old murder can be. But for all that they'd learned, for all that modern science and old-fashioned detective work had accomplished, one crucial question remained unanswered. Who killed Joseph Henry Lovelace? And that question, Sheriff May made clear, would keep the case officially open even though everyone involved, the killer, the victim, the witnesses, had been dead for decades. What is justice? Is a question that echoes through this story at every turn. Was justice served when Joseph Henry Lovelace was arrested for murdering Agnes? When he escaped from jail? When someone caught him and killed him? When his remains were identified a century after his death? The answer depends on which justice you're asking about: the justice of the courts, the justice of the community, or the justice of history itself. The official position of the Clark County Sheriff's Office is that Joseph Henry Lovelace was murdered, and his murder remains an unsolved homicide. This is technically correct. Someone killed him. Someone dismembered his body. Someone hid his remains in a cave. These are crimes by any legal definition, and those crimes have never been prosecuted. The perpetrators have never been identified. In the eyes of the law, Joseph Henry Lovelace is a murder victim whose killers remain at large. Never mind that those killers are certainly dead themselves by now, that more than a century has passed, that bringing charges is impossible. But there's another kind of justice at work in this story, the rough frontier justice that Sheriff May hinted at when he told reporters, "Back in 1916, it was the Wild West up here, and most likely the locals took care of the problem." This wasn't justice in the courtroom sense. This was the older kind of justice, the kind that operates outside official channels, the kind that says some crimes are so heinous that the community itself must respond. Joseph Henry Lovelace had murdered his wife brutally. He'd done it in front of their children. He'd shown no remorse, and he'd escaped from custody, making a mockery of the legal system. When he broke out of that jail in May of 1916, he may have thought he was free. But freedom was an illusion. Someone was already looking for him. The most compelling theory, the one that bioarchaeologist Samantha Blatt articulated when she examined the case, is that Agnes's family killed Joseph Henry. They had come to Du Bois for her funeral on May 16th. They had seen what he'd done to her. Newspaper accounts from the time noted that her head had been nearly severed, that the violence had been extreme. Imagine being a father, a brother, a cousin, and seeing that. Imagine the rage and grief that would produce. Then imagine learning, 2 days later, that the man who did it had escaped from jail. Again, that he was out there somewhere free while Agnes was in the ground. What would you do? If Agnes's family did kill Joseph Henry Lovelace, they showed a kind of symmetry in their method. He had attacked Agnes with an axe. They dismembered him with multiple sharp tools. He had taken her life with brutal violence. They took his life and then erased him, cutting his body into pieces, removing his head, distributing the parts so that he couldn't even be buried whole. There's a grim poetry to it, a message that would have been clear to anyone who understood what had happened. This is what happens when you murder a woman and try to run. But we don't know for certain it was Agnes's family. Could have been local law enforcement acting unofficially. Could have been vigilantes. It could have been fellow criminals who felt Lovelace had crossed a line, who understood that murdering your wife brought attention and heat that was bad for everyone's business. The cave system where his body was found required local knowledge to navigate. Whoever did this knew the area. They knew the caves. They knew how to dismember a body efficiently. And they knew how to keep a secret because no one talked. No one confessed. No one left a note or a confession. The secret held for 63 years until the remains were accidentally discovered, and then for another 40 years until science could unlock the mystery of identity. For the descendants of Joseph Henry Lovelace, the identification brought a complicated kind of closure. The 87-year-old grandson in California who provided the DNA sample had known his grandfather's name but little else about him. The family had kept the story quiet, perhaps out of shame, perhaps simply because no one knew the full details. When the identification was confirmed, when the newspapers dug up the old articles about the murder and the escapes and the aliases, the family suddenly had to confront a history that was far darker than they'd imagined. Your grandfather wasn't just an absent figure or a man who'd left the family. He was a murderer who'd been murdered in turn, a man who'd lived by aliases and died in violence, whose body had been cut apart and hidden in a cave. For the descendants of Agnes, if any could be located, there might have been a different kind of resolution. Confirmation that the man who killed their ancestor had himself been killed. Proof that someone had acted, that her death hadn't gone completely unavenged, that in the rough justice of the time, there had been a reckoning. Whether that brings comfort or just opens old wounds is a question each family member would have to answer for themselves. The case also raised interesting questions about the limits of forensic science and the scope of justice. The identification of Joseph Henry Lovelace was a triumph of modern technology applied to a very cold case. It showed what's possible when you combine DNA analysis with genealogical research, when you have volunteers willing to spend thousands of hours building family trees and tracking down records. The DNA Doe Project has solved dozens of similar cases, giving names back to people who died unknown. But in solving this case, they also opened up the question of Lovelace's own murder. They turned an old skeleton into a crime victim, which meant acknowledging that crimes had been committed against him, despite the crimes he himself had committed. Sheriff Bart May was clear that the investigation would remain open, that if new evidence emerged, old letters, a deathbed confession transcribed by family members, photographs, diaries, they would follow it up. But he was also realistic about the prospects. "Who knows?" said Lee Bingham Redgrave from the DNA Doe Project. "Someone might recognize that name and say, 'Oh, let me look at the old family photos.' Someone may find something, an old news story, that isn't digitized. It's possible. People clean out attics and find things all the time. The elderly remember stories they heard as children. Local historians discover documents that have been misfiled for decades. But the likelihood of solving who killed Joseph Henry Lovelace decreases with every passing year. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps there's a kind of justice in leaving that question permanently open, in saying that yes, this was murder, but it was murder in a specific context, in a specific time, under specific circumstances that make the usual categories of justice inadequate. Joseph Henry Loveless was killed because he killed. He was dismembered because he had savagely attacked his wife. He was hidden because he had repeatedly shown that he could not be contained by normal legal measures. His murder was both a crime and a kind of communal response to crime. Both things can be true simultaneously. The Buffalo Cave, where his remains were found, is still there. It's part of what became known as the Civil Defense Cave System during the Cold War, when the government designated certain caves as potential fallout shelters. You can still visit the area, though the caves themselves are dangerous and require experience to navigate safely. The cave entrance looks like thousands of other cave entrances across the American West, a dark opening in the limestone, nothing to suggest the secret it held for so long. In Payson, Utah, in the Loveless family plot, Joseph Henry's headstone still stands. The death year is still blank. Perhaps no one will ever fill it in. Perhaps it's better that way, left as a question, an acknowledgement that some stories don't have neat endings, that some lives resist being wrapped up in simple narratives of good and evil, victim and perpetrator. Agnes Octavia Caldwell Loveless has her own marker somewhere, probably in Soda Springs or Du Bois, wherever her family chose to bury her after that May funeral in 1916. She was 36 years old when she died. She left behind for children who grew up without either parent. She deserves to be remembered as more than just a victim, more than just the woman murdered by the man in the cave. She was a person who lived and loved and raised children and endured things we can only imagine, married to a man who gave her false names along with everything else. The children, Thelma, and the others whose names appear in census records and occasionally in newspaper accounts, they went on to live full lives. Thelma married, had children, died in 1972 at age 71, long before her father's remains were discovered. Her grandson, the man who provided the DNA sample, is himself elderly now, carrying the weight of a history he never knew he had. What must it be like to learn, late in life, that your family story is so much darker than you thought? That the grandfather who was simply absent was actually a killer who was killed? That genetic analysis has connected you across a century to violence and mystery? These are the questions that linger when we talk about true crime, especially true crime from this distance in time. We're not just solving puzzles. We're uncovering family secrets. We're bringing to light things that people chose to bury, sometimes literally. Every identification, every cold case solved, every mystery unlocked ripples forward through families, communities, our collective understanding of history. Joseph Henry Loveless died in 1916, but the consequences of his life and death are still unfolding now, in 2025, as we tell his story and contemplate what it means. In the end, perhaps the greatest mystery isn't who killed Joseph Henry Loveless. Perhaps it's the question of how many Joseph Henry Lovelesses there were throughout history. Men who lived under false names, committed crimes, escaped justice temporarily, and then disappeared into the landscape, their fates unknown. How many Buffalo Caves are there, holding secrets that haven't been accidentally discovered yet? How many families have stories they don't quite know, gaps in the genealogy that will never be explained? The identification of Joseph Henry Loveless stands as the oldest cold case solved by forensic genealogy. That record may be broken someday. Technology keeps improving. More people take DNA tests. More records get digitized. More volunteers dedicate time to the painstaking work of building family trees and comparing genetic markers. Every year, more unknown people get their names back. Every year, more families get answers to questions they didn't even know to ask. And every year, we're reminded that the past isn't really past, that history is a living thing, that the violence of 1916 can reach forward and touch us in 2025 through the medium of DNA, through the work of dedicated researchers, through the persistence of people who believe that everyone deserves to be remembered, even men like Joseph Henry Loveless. And so we come to the end of this story, though in many ways the story has no end. The case remains officially open. The question of who killed Joseph Henry Loveless remains officially unanswered. The Buffalo Cave holds its silence, as caves do, indifferent to human drama, simply existing as it has for millennia. The mountains around Du Bois, Idaho, stand unchanged. The land continues. What we're left with are questions about justice and memory, about violence and consequences, about how we remember and why we remember and what it means to give a name back to someone who was unnamed for so long. We're left with the reminder that every skeleton has a story. Every cold case represents a person who lived and died and touched other lives in ways both large and small. We're left with the knowledge that science and dedication can unlock mysteries that once seemed permanently sealed. If you're still awake and listening, let these thoughts settle gently. If you've drifted off and these words are becoming part of your dreams, then may those dreams be peaceful. The story of Joseph Henry Loveless is dark, but it's also over for him, over for Agnes, over for everyone who lived through those events in May of 1916. We can examine it now from a distance, with compassion for all involved, with recognition of the complexity of human nature, with acknowledgement that sometimes there are no good answers, only the slow accumulation of facts and the patient work of trying to understand. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Woman Who Became Christy Crystal Creek. For 36 years, she had no name, just a designation given by investigators who found her remains scattered across a Montana hillside. They called her Christy Crystal Creek, after the place where a bear hunter stumbled upon what was left of her. 2 bullets in her skull. No identification. No witnesses. No one to claim her. But she did have a name. She had a family. She had a 5-year-old son who would spend most of his adult life searching for answers. Her name was Janet Lee Lucas, and this is her story. There's something unsettling about forgetting. Not the small things like where you left your keys or what you had for breakfast last Tuesday. I'm talking about the kind of forgetting that happens when someone disappears without explanation, when the living move forward while questions linger in the spaces left behind. When someone becomes a ghost not because they died, but because no one knew they had. This is a story about identity and absence, about how a person can vanish so completely that even in death, they remain unknown for decades. It's about the quiet persistence of those who refuse to stop searching, and the cold, methodical work of investigators who wouldn't let a Jane Doe remain nameless forever. Tonight, as you settle in, I want to tell you about a case that unfolded slowly, across decades and state lines, involving advanced DNA technology, suspected serial killers, and a family that never stopped wondering what happened to someone they loved. This isn't a story with easy answers or satisfying conclusions. It's messier than that, more human. And it begins not with a crime, but with a woman trying to find her way. Janet Lee Lucas was born in October of 1960 in California, though she wouldn't spend her whole life there. She grew up between California and Washington State, one of 8 siblings in a family that knew both joy and struggle. Those who knew her described her with words that paint a particular picture. Warm, she wore her heart on her sleeve, had a contagious smile. She was the kind of person who felt things deeply, who connected with people easily. By the time she reached her early 20s, Janet had a young son. He was 5 years old in 1983, and like many young mothers, Janet was navigating the complexities of parenthood while trying to find stability in her own life. Her twin brother, Jim, would later describe her as something of a partier, someone who enjoyed the social scene, who perhaps struggled sometimes with the weight of responsibility. This wasn't said with judgment, but with the familiarity of someone who knew his sister well, who understood her contradictions. In the summer of 1983, Janet and her son had been staying with Jim and his then-wife in Spokane, Washington. She was getting back on her feet, as Jim put it, trying to find her footing, but things weren't quite working out the way anyone had hoped. The last time Jim saw his sister alive, it wasn't under circumstances anyone would want to remember. He'd gone looking for her that afternoon and found her at a local bar called Bigfoot, sitting on a stool, drinking with a couple of men he didn't recognize. When Jim approached and told her she needed to come home to her son, Janet didn't react well. An argument erupted between them, voices raised, emotions high. Janet yelled that she didn't love any of them. The exact words escaped Jim's memory over the years, but the feeling remained sharp, the sound of his sister's anger, the barmaid telling him he needed to leave or they'd call the police. Jim left the bar that day feeling more irritated than worried. He figured Janet would come home when she was ready, that this was just another bump in their complicated sibling relationship. But Janet didn't come home that night, or the next, and she was never seen by her family again. The last confirmed sighting placed Janet in Sandpoint, Idaho, still in that summer of 1983. Sandpoint sits near the northern tip of Idaho, tucked against the shores of Lake Pend Oreille, surrounded by mountains and forests. It's the kind of place where people pass through, where the roads lead both toward somewhere and away from something else. What happened after Sandpoint remains unclear even now. No records show Janet living in Montana or spending any time there. No paper trail, no documented presence. Yet somehow, between the summer of 1983 and the fall of 1984, Janet Lucas ended up in Missoula, Montana, roughly 170 miles northeast of Sandpoint. And there, her life came to an end. To understand what might have happened to Janet, you have to understand something about Missoula in the early 1980s. On the surface, it appeared to be a typical college town, home to the University of Montana, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains. The Clark Fork River runs through it. People went hiking, fishing, lived what seemed like ordinary lives. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Women were disappearing. Between 1974 and 1986, at least 6 people were killed in and around Missoula and neighboring Ravalli County. These weren't random acts of violence spread across years of unrelated incidents. They bore similarities, patterns that suggested a single perpetrator. But in the early 80s, before sophisticated DNA analysis, before the kind of forensic techniques we take for granted now, these connections were difficult to prove. Victims went unidentified. Cases grew cold, and whoever was responsible remained free. Wayne Nathan Nance was born on October 18, 1955, in Missoula. He grew up in a mobile home outside of town, in an area called Milltown. To his neighbors and people who knew him, Nance seemed like an ordinary guy. He worked as a furniture mover, doing deliveries for a local store. He graduated from Sentinel High School in 1974. People who encountered him described him as friendly enough, helpful even. There was nothing about his outward appearance or demeanor that suggested he was capable of what investigators would later suspect. But Nance led a double life, and the crimes attributed to him paint a picture of someone who understood how to gain trust before exploiting it. His first suspected victim was Donna Lorraine Pounds, a 39-year-old woman who worked part-time at a Christian bookstore. She was killed on April 11, 1974, in her home in West Riverside, just outside Missoula. Nance was only 18 at the time, still a teenager, and he was friends with Donna's children. He lived close to the Pounds family. After Nance's death years later, evidence connecting him to this murder would be found among his possessions. For a decade after Donna Pounds was killed, there were no murders in the area clearly linked to the same perpetrator. But starting in 1984, women began disappearing around Missoula with alarming frequency. At the time, Nance worked as a bouncer at a local bar called The Cabin. It's been suggested that this job gave him access to potential victims, women who might have shown identification at the door, revealing personal information like addresses and birth dates. But this remains speculation. What's known for certain is that several young women went missing during this period, and their remains would later be discovered in rural areas east of Missoula. The landscape around Missoula is defined by its proximity to wilderness. You don't have to drive far from town before you're surrounded by forest, by land that's difficult to search, where someone could hide almost anything. This geography would play a crucial role in the story of Janet Lucas and the other women whose lives intersected with Wayne Nance's. In the early 1980s, forensic science was advancing but still limited. DNA analysis existed in rudimentary form, but the kind of genetic genealogy that would eventually identify Janet Lucas was decades away. Missing persons cases relied heavily on physical identification, on someone recognizing a face or reporting an absence. And if someone had no strong ties to a community, if they were transient or estranged from family, they could vanish with hardly a ripple. Janet Lucas fit that profile in some ways. She'd been staying with her brother temporarily. She'd been arguing with family. The last sighting placed her in Idaho, not Washington. For someone in that position, moving on to another town, another temporary situation, wouldn't have been unusual. And if something happened to her in a place where she had no documented presence, where no one expected to see her, the chances of anyone noticing her absence grew slim. This was the environment into which Janet disappeared. A young mother in her early 20s, possibly hitchhiking, possibly looking for work or a place to stay, possibly just trying to figure out what came next. And somewhere in that summer of 1983, somewhere between Sandpoint, Idaho, and the wilderness east of Missoula, Montana, her path crossed with someone who ended her life. On September 9th, 1985, a hunter was tracking a bear through the forest south of Missoula, in the area near Crystal Creek. The landscape there is rugged, characterized by dense stands of pine and fir, rocky terrain, and the kind of isolation that makes it ideal habitat for wildlife. It's not the sort of place where people typically wander unless they have a specific reason. The hunter wasn't looking for what he found. No one ever is in these situations. But there, scattered across a hillside, were human remains, skeletonized. The bones had been exposed to the elements for some time, picked over by scavengers, dispersed across the ground. There was no clothing nearby, no personal effects that might have provided immediate identification. Just bones, and two small but significant pieces of evidence. Bullets. Specifically, two .32 caliber bullets that had been fired into the victim's skull. The Missoula County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene. They documented everything carefully, photographed the area, collected the remains. Early examination suggested the victim had been female, relatively young, somewhere between 18 and 35 years old based on bone analysis. She had been short, somewhere between 4 feet 10 inches and 5 feet 2 inches, weighing between 90 and 110 pounds when she was alive. Dental work indicated she'd had extensive care, multiple fillings, 2 root canals. The techniques used in some of her dental work suggested possible Asian origin, the kind of procedures more commonly practiced in eastern parts of the world. But beyond these physical details, investigators had almost nothing. No identification, no missing persons report that matched, no witnesses who'd seen anything. No one came forward to claim her or provide information. She became what's known in law enforcement as a Jane Doe, an unidentified victim. And because she'd been found near Crystal Creek, someone in the sheriff's office gave her a placeholder name, Christy Crystal Creek. It's worth pausing here to consider what that name represents. It's an attempt at humanization, a way of referring to someone as more than just a case number or the victim. But it's also a substitute, a reminder that the real name, the real identity, remained unknown. For 36 years, that's all she would be. Christy Crystal Creek, a woman without a past, without a family that anyone could find, without a story beyond the manner of her death. The investigation into who Christy Crystal Creek had been moved forward in the ways investigations did before modern DNA analysis. Forensic anthropologists examined the bones, trying to determine ancestry, approximate age, any distinctive features that might help with identification. A forensic odontologist studied her dental work in detail, noting the unusual techniques that suggested international origins. Investigators entered her information into missing persons databases, both in the United States and Canada. They created facial reconstructions based on her skull structure, images of what she might have looked like when she was alive. Multiple versions of these reconstructions were produced over the years as techniques improved, each attempting to capture her features in a way that might trigger recognition. But nothing worked. Years passed, then a decade, then 2. The case file remained open, but active investigation slowed. There were other crimes to solve, other victims who could be identified. Christie Crystal Creek became one of those cases that haunted the investigators who'd worked on it, but for which there seemed to be no answers. What made this case even more troubling was its proximity to other similar discoveries. On Christmas Eve, 1984, less than a year before Christie Crystal Creek was found, another set of skeletal remains had been discovered in the same general area, near a place called Deer Creek. This victim was also female, also young, also killed by gunshot wounds to the head. She'd been given a similar placeholder name, Debbie Deer Creek. And there was yet another victim found even earlier in 1980. Her remains were discovered near Beavertail Hill, and she too became a Jane Doe, Betty Beavertail. The pattern was unmistakable. Young women, killed execution style, dumped in remote forested areas east of Missoula, left to decompose where scavengers and weather would make identification increasingly difficult. By the time Christie Crystal Creek was discovered, investigators already suspected they were dealing with a serial killer. The methods were too similar, the geography too consistent. But suspicion and proof are different things. Without identities for the victims, without witnesses or physical evidence linking the crimes to a specific perpetrator, the cases remained unsolved. Wayne Nance, still living in Missoula, still working as a furniture mover, remained free. If he was responsible for these deaths, as investigators suspected, he gave no outward sign of it. He continued his life, moving through the same town where his victims had last been seen, past the places where they disappeared from. It's one of the more disturbing aspects of cases like this, how predators can function in plain sight, how they can maintain the appearance of normalcy while committing acts of profound violence. The early DNA analysis that existed in the mid-1980s was used on these cases, but with limited success. The technology could confirm that remains were human, could sometimes determine biological sex, but the kind of detailed genetic analysis that would later become standard was still being developed. Commercial DNA databases didn't exist. Genetic genealogy was decades away from being a viable investigative tool. So the Jane Does remained unidentified, and their killer, if they shared one, remained unnamed. For Janet Lucas's family, these were years of uncertainty and grief without closure. Her son, who'd been 5 years old when she disappeared, grew up without his mother, carrying questions that had no answers. Her twin brother Jim carried the guilt of their last encounter, wondering if things might have been different if he'd handled that afternoon at the bar some other way. The rest of her siblings, her parents, her extended family, all of them lived with the absence of Janet without knowing what had happened to her. There's a particular kind of pain in not knowing. When someone dies and you can grieve them, there's at least the possibility of moving forward, of processing the loss. But when someone simply vanishes, when they're alive one day and gone the next with no explanation, no body, no confirmation of death, the grief becomes complicated. You can't move forward because there's always the possibility, however remote, that they might return. You can't properly grieve because doing so feels like giving up. So you exist in a suspended state, hoping and mourning simultaneously, unable to fully do either. Janet's family searched for her over the years. Her son, as he grew older, took up the search with particular determination. He looked through missing persons records, followed leads that went nowhere, held on to hope that was increasingly difficult to maintain. But without knowing that Janet had ever been in Montana, without any connection between her last known location in Idaho and the area where her remains lay undiscovered in terms of identity, there was no way for them to make the link to Christie Crystal Creek. Meanwhile, in Missoula, Wayne Nance's life was approaching its own violent conclusion. On December 12, 1985, just 3 months after Christie Crystal Creek's remains were found, Nance walked into the home of Michael and Teresa Shook in neighboring Ravalli County. He was armed with a gun and introduced himself as Conan the Barbarian. What followed was a brutal home invasion that left both Michael and Teresa dead, stabbed and tied up, their house set on fire in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Their 4 small children, locked in a bedroom, narrowly survived. Then, on September 3, 1986, Nance made what would be his final mistake. He broke into the home of Doug and Chris Wells. Doug was Nance's employer at the furniture store. The attack followed Nance's pattern. He subdued the couple, stabbed Doug in the chest with an 8-inch blade, beat him over the head, and raped Chris. But Doug survived the stabbing long enough to fight back. In the struggle, he managed to get hold of a rifle and shot Nance in the head, killing him. It was only after Nance's death, when investigators searched his home and collected DNA evidence, that the full scope of his crimes began to emerge. Hair samples matching Debbie Deer Creek were found in his truck. Photo booth pictures of him with another young woman were discovered among his possessions. Evidence taken from the Shook home, including a ceramic elk and a knife, were found in Nance's residence. The pattern became clear. Wayne Nance had been the Missoula Mauler, a serial killer who'd operated in the area for at least 12 years. With Nance's DNA on file, investigators began attempting to link him to the Jane Does, whose remains had been found east of Missoula. In 2006, more than 20 years after Debbie Deer Creek was discovered, advanced DNA analysis finally allowed for her identification. Her real name was Marcella Bachman. She'd been 16 years old when Nance killed her. With her identity confirmed and physical evidence linking Nance to her death, that case could finally be closed, at least in terms of knowing who she was and who had killed her. But Christy Crystal Creek remained unidentified. The DNA technology of the early 2000s, while more advanced than what had been available in the 80s, still had limitations. The remains were old, degraded, and the techniques available at the time couldn't extract enough usable genetic material to create a profile that could be compared to DNA databases. So Christy Crystal Creek remained a mystery. Investigators kept her case file open, updated her information as new forensic techniques became available, created new facial reconstructions as technology improved. But year after year passed without identification. 1985 became 1995, then 2005, then 2015. 30 years. 30 years of being nameless. 30 years of a family not knowing their loved one had been found. Of a young man not knowing his mother's remains had been lying in a sheriff's evidence room all along, waiting for science to catch up with grief. The breakthrough, when it finally came, resulted from a convergence of technological advancement, institutional support, and the persistent dedication of investigators who refused to let cold cases stay cold. By the late 20-teens, forensic science had evolved dramatically from where it had been in the 1980s. But more specifically, the field of forensic genetic genealogy had emerged as a powerful tool for identifying both unknown victims and unknown perpetrators. The technique that would finally identify Christy Crystal Creek had gained public attention in 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. That case demonstrated how investigators could use DNA profiles uploaded to commercial genealogy databases to identify suspects by tracing family trees and finding genetic relatives. The same technique could work in reverse for unidentified victims. Extract DNA, build a genetic profile, upload it to genealogy databases, find matches with distant relatives, construct family trees, and work backward to determine who the unidentified person might be. But there was a problem with Christy Crystal Creek's case. Previous attempts at DNA extraction had failed. The remains were degraded, had been exposed to weather and wildlife for an unknown period before discovery. Traditional DNA analysis methods couldn't get enough usable genetic material from the bones. The case had been deemed, in the unfortunate terminology of forensic science, unsuitable for analysis. This is where Othram Incorporated entered the picture. Based in the Woodlands, Texas, Othram specialized in cases that had defeated other labs. They developed proprietary techniques for extracting and analyzing degraded DNA, methods that could work with samples other labs had given up on. They'd successfully helped law enforcement agencies identify victims and perpetrators in cases decades old, cases where the evidence had been written off as unusable. In 2021, with financial assistance from the Montana Department of Justice's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, the Missoula County Sheriff's Cold Case Unit partnered with Othram to take another look at Christy Crystal Creek. Special Deputies Susan Lane and Diana Parker led the effort, working alongside Special Agent Steve Bush from the FBI. It was a significant investment of resources and time, and there were no guarantees it would work. Othrum's forensic scientists examined what remained of the evidence from the 1985 discovery. They reviewed the case files, studied the previous failed attempts at extraction, and determined they could build a profile. The process was painstaking. Extract DNA from degraded bone samples. Amplify the genetic material using techniques that didn't exist when the remains were first found. Build a comprehensive genetic profile that could be compared to databases. After weeks of intensive work, they succeeded. They had a usable DNA profile for Christie Crystal Creek. But having the profile was only the first step. Now came the genealogy research, the part that required equal parts science and detective work. The genetic profile was compared to DNA profiles in commercial genealogy databases, specifically GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. These databases contain genetic information voluntarily uploaded by people interested in tracing their ancestry or finding biological relatives. They're built on the principle that DNA tells stories about family connections, that genetic matches can reveal relationships people didn't know existed. The profile generated matches. Not direct matches, but connections to distant relatives, people who shared common ancestors with the unidentified woman. The investigators now had genetic breadcrumbs to follow. They began constructing family trees, working backward from the people who'd matched, trying to find the points where family lines converged. They looked at who'd married whom, who'd had children when, who'd lived where. They cross-referenced this genetic data with traditional genealogical records. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries. After weeks of intense genealogy research, a picture began to emerge. The family trees they were building pointed to a specific family in Spokane, Washington, the Lucas family. Investigators began reaching out to members of this family, explaining what they were investigating, asking if anyone had been missing, if anyone had disappeared in the early 1980s without explanation. The answer, of course, was yes. Janet Lee Lucas, last seen in 1983. The pieces began fitting together. Janet had been from Spokane. She'd last been seen in Idaho. The age range matched. The time frame matched. But to confirm the identification, they needed more than circumstantial genealogical evidence. They needed direct DNA comparison. Members of Janet's family agreed to provide DNA samples for testing. The samples were analyzed and compared to the profile created from Christie Crystal Creek's remains. The results were conclusive. After 36 years, Christie Crystal Creek had a name. She was Janet Lee Lucas, 23 years old when she died, a mother and daughter and sister who'd been missing for nearly 4 decades. On May 10, 2021, the Missoula County Sheriff's Office held a press conference to announce the identification. Sheriff T.J. McDermott, Detective Captain Dave Conway, and other members of the investigative team faced cameras and reporters to share news that had been decades in the making. They explained the process, thanked the various agencies and individuals who'd contributed to the identification, and most importantly, they gave Janet her name back. For Janet's family, the news brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief, certainly, at finally knowing what had happened, at having the decades of uncertainty resolved. But also heartbreak, learning that the person they'd been searching for had been dead this whole time, had been lying unidentified in Montana while they searched for her in Washington. The family released a statement that captured this emotional complexity. They expressed gratitude for finally being able to bring Janet home, to give her the peace and rest she deserved. They acknowledged that after decades of missing her, they were brokenhearted to learn she'd been taken so young, had spent so many years unidentified and alone. But they emphasized that she'd never been unloved, had always been missed, searched for, and most importantly, never forgotten. Janet's son, who'd been 5 when she disappeared, who'd spent much of his adult life searching for his mother, finally had answers. Not all the answers he wanted, but some. He now knew his mother hadn't abandoned him, hadn't chosen to leave. She'd been killed. She'd been a victim. And while that knowledge brought its own pain, it also provided a form of closure that decades of uncertainty couldn't offer. But with identification came new questions. The investigators' focus shifted. For 36 years, the question had been, who is Christie Crystal Creek? Now the question became, what happened to Janet Lucas? Who killed her? And could they prove it? The proximity of where Janet's remains were found to where Marcella Bachmann's remains had been discovered, the similar methods of killing, the time frame that overlapped with Wayne Nance's active period, all of this pointed to Nance as the likely perpetrator. But Nance had been dead since 1986, killed by Doug Wells before he could be arrested, tried, or convicted of any of his crimes. There would be no trial, no confession, no legal resolution. The cold case unit began reviewing all available evidence from Nance's case file, looking for any concrete link to Janet Lucas. They examined records of his movements in 1983 and 84. They looked for any indication that he'd been in Sandpoint, Idaho, where Janet was last seen. They searched for connections, however tenuous, that might explain how Janet ended up in Missoula. One theory that emerged suggested Janet might have hitchhiked after leaving Sandpoint, a common practice at the time, particularly among young people traveling with limited resources. If she'd been picked up by Nance or encountered him in some way during her travel, that could explain how she ended up in his orbit. Another theory focused on Nance's work as a bouncer at the Cabin Bar in Missoula. If Janet had made it to Missoula on her own and visited that bar, Nance might have seen her identification, noted her birthday, and used that as a conversation starter. Investigators found it noteworthy that Nance and Janet shared the same birthday, October 18th. It's the kind of coincidence that might have been used to establish rapport, to seem friendly, to gain trust. But these remained theories. Despite the circumstantial evidence, despite the patterns and probabilities, investigators couldn't definitively prove Wayne Nance had killed Janet Lucas. The DNA evidence that had linked him to Marcella Bachmann wasn't present in Janet's case. No hair samples, no photographs, no physical evidence that created an undeniable connection. So while Janet Lee Lucas had finally been identified, while her family could finally bring her home and lay her to rest properly, her case remained officially unsolved. The man most likely responsible for her death had been dead for 35 years. Justice, in the traditional sense, was impossible. The identification of Janet Lee Lucas as Christy Crystal Creek marked the end of one mystery and the beginning of another kind of reckoning. For the Missoula County Sheriff's Office, it represented both an achievement and a reminder of what remained unfinished. Detective Captain Dave Conway was direct in his statement following the identification. "We cannot rest on our success of having finally identified Janet. We must now seek justice for Janet." But what does justice mean when the person most likely responsible is already dead? How do you seek accountability when the one who should be held accountable is beyond the reach of any court or prison? These questions don't have satisfying answers, but they're the reality of many cold cases that get solved decades after the fact. The investigation into Janet's death continues, at least on paper. The Missoula Sheriff's Office has asked for the public's help, releasing a photograph of Janet from 1979, 4 years before her death. They've requested that anyone who might have known her or seen her in the Missoula area during the summer of 1983 or into 1984 come forward with information. It's a long shot, for decades have passed. Memories fade, witnesses die or move away, and the people who might have seen something significant likely didn't recognize its significance at the time. But investigations like this persist for reasons that go beyond the practical hope of finding new evidence. They persist because giving up sends a message that some victims matter less than others, that cases can be abandoned when they become inconvenient or difficult. They persist because families deserve to know that someone is still asking questions, still refusing to let their loved one become just another forgotten statistic. For Janet's family, the identification process brought them back into contact with each other in ways that decades of separation had prevented. 7 siblings, scattered across different states, living different lives, reunited by the shared grief of Janet's confirmed death. Her son, now an adult with children of his own, could tell his kids about their grandmother, could share stories that had been held in suspense for so long. Janet became a grandmother to 4 children who would never meet her, but who could at least know she'd existed, that she'd been loved, that she hadn't been forgotten. The case also became part of a larger conversation about advances in forensic science and what they mean for cold cases. The technique that identified Janet Lucas has been used successfully in hundreds of other cases since. Unknown victims have been given their names back. Unknown perpetrators have been identified and arrested. The intersection of traditional detective work with genetic genealogy has opened new possibilities for solving crimes that once seemed permanently beyond resolution. But these advances also raise ethical questions. The DNA databases that made Janet's identification possible rely on voluntary participation by people who uploaded their genetic information for genealogy purposes, not criminal investigation. While most people seem comfortable with law enforcement using these databases to identify victims and serious criminals, the practice exists in a legal and ethical gray area. Questions about privacy, consent, and the appropriate limits of genetic surveillance remain subjects of ongoing debate. There's also something to consider about the economics of cold case investigation. The work that identified Janet Lucas required funding from the Montana Department of Justice's Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, partnership with a private forensic laboratory, weeks of intensive genealogy research by specialists, and coordination between multiple agencies. It was expensive, time-consuming, and required resources that not every jurisdiction can afford. This means that for every Janet Lucas who gets identified, there are unknown victims in other jurisdictions whose cases remain unsolved, not because the technology doesn't exist, but because the money or institutional will to apply it isn't available. The story of Christy Crystal Creek becoming Janet Lee Lucas also illuminates something about how we talk about victims and violence. For 36 years, she existed primarily as a forensic puzzle, a set of bones and bullets, a question mark in a cold case file. The details of her death, the manner of her disposal, the forensic analysis of her remains, these technical aspects dominated how she was discussed and understood. It's only with identification that she became fully human again in the public imagination, that she could be seen as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother, rather than just a victim. This pattern appears frequently in cases involving unidentified remains. The humanity of the person becomes abstracted, reduced to measurements and dental records and anthropological assessments. When Christy Crystal Creek was thought to be possibly of Asian descent based on her dental work and bone structure, that became the primary way she was categorized, even though it ultimately proved to be incorrect. Janet Lucas was not of Asian descent. She was a woman from California and Washington, and the characteristics that led to that initial assessment were misinterpretations of perfectly ordinary variation within human anatomy. It's a reminder of how forensic science, while valuable, can create its own narratives that obscure as much as they reveal. Wayne Nance died without ever being convicted of any murders, though he's now believed to have killed at least 6 people and possibly more. The true extent of his crimes will likely never be known. There are probably other victims, other women whose remains haven't been found or haven't been connected to him. He operated during a time when serial killers could be frighteningly effective, when the lack of DNA databases and coordinated law enforcement communication meant that patterns went unrecognized, that predators could move between jurisdictions without triggering alarms. The fact that Nance died at the hands of Doug Wells, his intended victim, has become part of how his story is told. There's a narrative satisfaction to it, a sense of justice even though it came outside the legal system. Doug Wells survived having a knife plunged into his chest, fought back despite being beaten, and ended the threat not just to himself and his wife but to any future victims Nance might have claimed. It's the kind of ending that feels almost too dramatic for reality, and yet it's exactly what happened. But focusing too much on Nance's death, on the dramatic conclusion of his killing spree, risks overshadowing his victims. Donna Pounds, who worked at a Christian bookstore and was killed when Nance was just 18. Marcella Bachman, 16 years old when she died. Devonna Nelson, 15. Michael and Teresa Shook, who left behind for small children. And Janet Lucas, 23 years old, with a 5-year-old son who would grow up without her. These are the people who deserve to be remembered, whose lives were cut short, whose stories were interrupted by violence. The fact that most of them remained unidentified for years or decades after their deaths is itself a kind of violence, an erasure that compounds the original crime. Janet's twin brother Jim has had to live with their last encounter for 4 decades now. That argument at the Bigfoot bar, Janet yelling that she didn't love any of them, Jim leaving without her, assuming she'd come home when she was ready. He's carried the guilt of wondering if he should have done something different, if he could have prevented what happened. But the reality is that Janet's death wasn't his fault. It was the fault of whoever killed her, most likely Wayne Nance. Jim couldn't have known that sending his sister away that afternoon would mean never seeing her alive again. No one could have known that. This kind of survivor's guilt is common among family members of murder victims. The what-ifs and if-onlys that replay endlessly, the search for some moment where a different choice might have changed everything. But these searches for alternative timelines rarely bring peace. They're a way of trying to maintain control over events that were never controllable, of believing that if only someone had done something differently, the tragedy could have been prevented. Sometimes that's true, but often, the determining factor was the choice made by the perpetrator, and no amount of second-guessing by the victim's family would have changed that fundamental reality. The photograph of Janet that the sheriff's office released, taken in 1979, shows a young woman who looks both hopeful and uncertain, the way many people in their early 20s look. She had her whole life ahead of her. She should have gotten to see her son grow up, should have become the grandmother to those 4 children while she was alive to meet them. She should have had the chance to figure out who she wanted to be, to move past whatever struggles she was facing in 1983, to build a life that included stability and joy. Instead, her life ended violently in the Montana wilderness. Her body left to decompose. Her identity stripped away for more than 3 decades. This is the reality of violent crime. The way it doesn't just end a life but erases the person from the present and leaves their loved ones suspended in uncertainty. Now, at least Janet Lucas is no longer Christy Crystal Creek. She has her name back. Her remains have been returned to her family. She can be properly mourned and remembered. Her son knows what happened, can finally grieve rather than wonder. The uncertainty has ended, even if the questions haven't all been answered. The case remains officially unsolved, but that designation feels almost beside the point. Everyone involved, from investigators to family members to those who followed the case, believes Wayne Nance was responsible. The lack of concrete proof is a technicality, a frustration, but it doesn't change what likely happened. And while that lack of legal closure is disappointing, it's also the reality of justice delayed for decades. Sometimes the best resolution available is knowing the truth, even when that truth can't be prosecuted. Detective Captain Conway's words continue to resonate. We must now seek justice for Janet, but perhaps the real justice, in a case like this, isn't about prosecution or punishment. Perhaps it's about restoration, restoring Janet's identity, restoring her place in her family's history, ensuring that she's remembered not as Christy Crystal Creek, a nameless victim, but as Janet Lee Lucas, a real person with a real life that mattered. In the end, that might be the most important thing. Names matter. Identity matters. Being remembered as yourself, not as an abstraction or a placeholder, matters. For 36 years, Janet Lucas was deprived of that. Now she has it back. It's not enough. It doesn't undo the violence or bring her back or give her son his mother. But it's something. And sometimes, something is all we can hope for. The story of Janet Lee Lucas reminds us that behind every cold case, there's a person who lived, who was loved, who had hopes and dreams and struggles and relationships. Behind every unidentified victim, there's a family who doesn't know what happened, who searches and hopes and grieves without closure. And sometimes, if we're patient enough, if technology advances enough, if investigators refuse to give up, those victims get their names back. Those families get answers, even if the answers bring more pain than relief. As you drift off tonight, think about Janet. Think about the boy who spent his adult life searching for his mother. Think about the investigators who worked for decades to give a name to a set of remains. Think about how persistence and technology and human determination can sometimes, just sometimes, reach backward through time to restore what was taken. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.